San Ysidro, California, Wednesday, July 18, 1984. A man walks into a McDonald's restaurant carrying 3 weapons and enough ammunition to kill an entire neighborhood. 77 minutes later, 21 people are dead. And the most disturbing part of this story is not what happened inside that restaurant. It is what happened the day before, and why nobody stopped it. To understand what took place that afternoon, you first have to understand the place. San Ysidro sits at the very southern tip of California, pressed against the border with Mexico, its streets ending just a few hundred yards from the Tijuana crossing, one of the busiest land borders in the world. In the early 1980s, roughly 13,000 people lived there, almost all working-class Latino families, many of them recent immigrants building lives on the American side of the line. A neighborhood of modest homes, small businesses and bonds tight enough that people knew each other by name, where families gathered on weekday afternoons, and where a McDonald's on the main boulevard was not simply a fast food restaurant, it was a gathering point, a familiar, safe place. The McDonald's on San Ysidro Boulevard was exactly the kind of place people didn't think about until they were already inside it, familiar in the way that familiar things become invisible. The tile floors, the plastic booths, the smell of the fryers, the cheerful noise of a busy Wednesday afternoon. Children played in the indoor play area while their parents finished their meals. Elderly regulars settled in for afternoon coffee and stayed longer than they had planned to. Teenagers worked the summer counter shifts to earn a little money before school started again. On that particular Wednesday, a 17-year-old named Wendy Flanagan was working the register. She had just made the varsity cheerleading squad for her senior year, was in the middle of a fundraising drive for her uniform, and had taken an extra shift to help out during a busy stretch. It was her very first job. She would later describe herself that summer with a precision that only hindsight allows. Loud, happy, someone who had never experienced any real loss in her life. In the kitchen behind her, a 16-year-old named Alberto Leos was finishing his shift, a local kid who had grown up a few blocks away and thought about the job the way most teenagers do, as a way to fill the days and earn a little cash. Across the dining area, families occupied the booths and tables near the windows. A pregnant teenager sat with a younger relative. An 11-year-old boy named Daniel Flores had ridden his bicycle from his home just down the street to get an ice cream cone. A young mother sat with her 8-month-old baby Carlos. An elderly man had placed a box of donuts carefully on the table beside him as he settled in. People who had absolutely no reason to believe the afternoon would be anything other than what it appeared to be ordinary. At just before 4 o'clock, a black Mercury Marquis pulled slowly into the parking lot. The man behind the wheel sat for a moment, opened the door, and stepped out. He was dressed in camouflage pants and a dark maroon shirt. Slung over his shoulder was a weapon. In his hands was a cloth bag packed so densely with ammunition that it pulled at his arms as he crossed the lot and pushed open the front door. What he did in the next hour and 17 minutes would force America to confront something it had never truly faced before and had no language to describe. What happened that afternoon did not begin in a parking lot. It began decades earlier, in a small town in Ohio, in a childhood defined by abandonment, physical pain, and the slow accumulation of damage that never found any release. James Oliver Huberty was born in Canton, Ohio, in the early 1940s. When he was 3 years old, he contracted polio, a disease that permanently affected his nervous system, leaving him with lasting difficulty walking and, according to his father, chronic pain that made him quick-tempered from a very young age. He wore steel and leather braces on both legs as a boy. He was already set apart from other children before he had any chance to find his footing. Then, when James was around 7 years old, his mother left. His father had purchased a farm in the Pennsylvania Amish countryside, and when Issel Huberty refused to go, she walked away from her family to pursue religious missionary work and did not come back. A minister who knew the family later recalled that the young James blamed God entirely for taking her. His father found him more than once slumped against the family chicken coop, crying alone. He grew up sullen, withdrawn, with few friends. His only real companion was his dog, and from his earliest teens his consuming interest was firearms. a natural with guns, an amateur gunsmith by his mid-teens. It was the one domain where he felt truly capable, precise, and in control. He earned a degree in sociology in college, then studied mortuary science in Pittsburgh. Skilled at the technical work of embalming, he was fired from his first funeral home because he could not show any empathy toward grieving families. He met his wife Etna during those years, married her in the mid-1960s, and had 2 daughters, Zelia and Cassandra. He found steady work as a welder in Massacre, Ohio, and held it for more than a decade. He was skilled at it. For a period, he appeared to be a functional man, a provider, a husband, a father with a house and a routine. But beneath the surface, something was steadily falling apart in ways that would take years to fully reveal themselves. During the 1970s, Huberty became deeply immersed in survivalist ideology. He became convinced that the Cold War would end in nuclear catastrophe, that the American government was actively conspiring against its own citizens, that international bankers were deliberately engineering the collapse of the national economy, and that the breakdown of society was not a distant possibility but an approaching certainty. He stockpiled food by the thousands of dollars and accumulated firearms and ammunition with the intensity of a man who believed genuinely and completely that he was preparing for the end of things. He put a no trespassing sign on his property. He threatened on more than one occasion to shoot anyone who came too close to his home without warning. He had a long documented history of domestic violence against Etna and against the daughters she was trying to raise in the same house as him. Etna had tried for years, quietly, persistently, carefully, to get him into some form of counselling. He always refused. And around the mid-1970s, something else began: disembodied voices, sounds and speech that no one else in the house could hear. His wife knew. She tried to manage what she could not fix, tried to shield the girls and herself from the worst of what was happening inside him. But she could not stop what was building. In late 1982, the Babcock and Wilcox plant, where he had worked for years, was shut down. He lost his welding job, the one structure that had given his life any semblance of order, and a motorcycle accident around that same period worsened old nerve damage from his childhood polio, causing his right arm to shake in ways that made precision work impossible, even if he had found another opening. He tried to pivot into real estate, staking money he could not afford on a deal that ultimately collapsed and left him worse off than before. His paranoia deepened measurably. The survivalist preparations intensified. His wife later described a period in which he spoke openly about shooting random people if he ever lost his job again. He once walked up to a police officer on a street corner and calmly declared himself a war criminal. His wife had been following in her car and lost the patrol vehicle in traffic before she could explain. In early 1984, the family made the decision to move to Tijuana, Mexico, believing the lower cost of living might create some breathing room, some possibility of a fresh beginning. But Huberty spoke almost no Spanish. He could find no employment there. He felt rejected and increasingly hostile toward the Mexican community around him, which his family had found welcoming and warm. Within 3 months, the family relocated again, north across the border to San Ysidro, renting an apartment on Averill Road, a short walk from the main boulevard. They were the only Anglo-American family in the building. Huberty was openly rude to his neighbors from the moment they arrived. He found work as a security guard at an apartment complex in the nearby town of Chula Vista, but even that did not last. 8 days before the massacre, his employer dismissed him, citing poor performance and general physical instability. 41 years old, unemployed, and surrounded by the community he had spent months growing to resent. There is a sequence of events in the days before the massacre that is almost unbearable to trace, because within those days there were moments, specific, identifiable moments, where what happened might have been prevented. Each one came, and then passed without consequence. A few days before the Wednesday of the massacre, Huberty sat down with his wife Etna and told her something genuinely unusual. He told her he believed he had a mental health problem. For a man who had spent years dismissing Etna's concerns about the voices and the paranoia, who had refused counselling with contempt every time it was suggested, who had treated the idea of needing help as an accusation rather than an offer, this was a rare and significant admission. A crack in the wall. But nothing happened immediately. No appointment was made, no call was placed that day. The moment simply passed, unremarked upon, and they went on with the evening. On the Tuesday before the massacre, Huberty called the San Ysidro Health Centre's mental health unit. His voice on the phone was calm, measured, so measured that the receptionist heard no urgency in it whatsoever. He said he wanted to schedule an appointment, offered no details about the nature of his problem, left his name and number, and was told someone would call him back. His file was logged as a non-crisis inquiry, to be returned within 48 hours. Routine. What no one knew yet was that the receptionist had misspelled his name. He had said Huberty. She had written Schuberty. The difference between those two spellings was the difference between a file that could be found and one that could not. When Etna, growing increasingly afraid, later called every mental health clinic in the phone book one by one, trying to identify which clinic her husband had contacted, the right clinic told her that no one by the name of Huberty had ever been in touch with them. The misspelling had erased him from the record entirely. She could not correct what she could not find. One wrong letter, on one form, on one Tuesday afternoon, had ended the last available chance. After making that call, Huberty sat beside the telephone and waited. He sat for hours. The phone did not ring. He eventually got up, rode off on his motorcycle without explanation, and returned later, calmer than before. That evening he did something almost domestic. Rode bicycles to the park with his daughters, watched a film with his wife. The night passed without anything that, looking back, anyone could have grabbed onto. The next morning, Wednesday, July 18th, the family went to the San Diego Zoo together. They walked through the exhibits in the summer heat like any family on a summer morning. The parents, the daughters, the familiar unhurried rhythm of an outing with nowhere specific to be. At some point during that walk, Huberty turned to Etna and told her, plainly and without raising his voice, that his life was over. He said, "Society had their chance." She heard the words. She did not fully absorb what they meant or what they were pointing toward. The clinic had still not called. He was talking about the clinic, she thought. He had made dark pronouncements before, many of them, about the government, about nuclear war, about his own sense of being persecuted by forces larger than himself, and none of those pronouncements had ever become anything. After the zoo, the family stopped for lunch at a McDonald's in another part of the city, in a neighborhood called Claremont, and then drove back to the apartment on Everill Road. Back home, Huberty walked into the bedroom where Etna was resting. He was already dressed, camouflage pants, dark maroon shirt. He leaned over her and said he wanted to kiss her goodbye. She kissed him, then asked where he was going. He said he was going hunting for humans. She did not react. She had heard things like that before, and nothing had ever followed them. He walked to the front door where his 12-year-old daughter Zelia was standing in the hallway. He looked at her and said, "Goodbye. I won't be back." He stepped outside, got into the black Mercury Marquis sitting at the curb, and drove to the end of the street. It was just before 4 o'clock when James Huberty pulled into the parking lot of the McDonald's on San Ysidro boulevard. He stepped out armed with 3 weapons, a 9mm Uzi carbine, a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, and a Browning semi-automatic pistol. He had enough ammunition to keep firing for a very long time. There were 45 people inside the restaurant when he walked through the door. He aimed his shotgun first at a teenage employee named John Arnold from roughly 15 feet away. The gun jammed. In that split second of confusion, the restaurant's 22-year-old manager, Neva Kane, stepped toward the counter to see what was happening. Huberty cleared the jam and shot her once beneath the left eye. She died within minutes. Neva Kane was the first. He wounded the teenage employee in the chest and arm, then ordered everyone to the floor. He shouted that he had already killed before and intended to kill again. A 25-year-old customer named Victor Rivera stood up and tried to reason with him. Huberty shot him 14 times. What followed was a systematic, relentless progression through the dining area that paused for nothing. He moved with the Uzi, the shotgun, and the pistol switching between them, reloading continuing. He targeted a cluster of women and children near the back of the restaurant. He shot a 19-year-old woman dead. He shot a 9-year-old girl named Claudia Perez multiple times. He aimed at an 11-year-old named Aurora Peña, and at that precise moment an 18-year-old pregnant woman named Jackie Rez threw herself over the child. He fired the Uzi into Jackie Rez 48 times. Aurora, pinned beneath her aunt's body, felt the woman shaking against her as the rounds struck. Jackie's 8-month-old son Carlos was nearby, crying. Huberty shouted at the infant, then he raised his pistol and fired once into the child's back. A father named Ronald Herrera covered a 12-year-old boy he did not know with his own body, sheltering beneath a table booth. He was shot 6 times: stomach, chest, arm, hip, shoulder, head. He survived. Young Daniel Flores did not. Wendy Flanagan reached a staircase at the rear of the building and descended into a storage closet, pressing into the dark alongside other survivors. She later described a specific smell she has never been able to forget: the sharp, acrid smell of human sweat under mortal terror. She was told afterward it is a chemical the body releases at the outer edge of fear. "They told me it was the smell of death," she said. Alberto Leos, in the kitchen, was shot. He survived, but barely. Outside, the first emergency calls reached police within minutes of Huberty entering the building. Officer Miguel Rosario arrived quickly, took in what he was looking at: a man with a rifle firing both inside the restaurant and outward at people in the parking lot and on the sidewalk, and immediately radioed for backup. He took cover behind his patrol car. He did not attempt to enter the building. No officer entered. In 1984, the established protocol for active shooting situations was containment: surround the building, seal every possible exit, and wait for the specialized tactical unit to arrive and take command of the scene. A command post was set up 2 blocks from the restaurant. Officers held the line and waited for a structure that was not designed for what was happening inside. But Huberty had no interest in escaping. He was not waiting, not negotiating, not demanding anything. He moved. Through the dining area and into the kitchen and back out again, through the front door and onto the street. Firing at first responders and news crews and passing cars, then back inside. He fired more than 250 rounds in total, because he switched continuously between 3 different weapons and the restaurant's windows had been shattered by gunfire. Officers on the perimeter could not determine how many shooters were inside, and the reflected glass made visual confirmation nearly impossible. They could hear every shot, every burst from the Uzi, every pause and every resumption, for over an hour. During a lull in the firing, Aurora Peña, lying motionless beside the body of her aunt, opened her eyes. Huberty was standing nearby, looking at her. He swore at her. He threw a bag of French fries. Then he picked up his shotgun and shot her again, in the arm, the neck, and the chest. She survived and spent more time hospitalized than any other person to come out of that building. She was 11 years old. The restaurant's background music was still playing. The hamburger patties on the grills were still cooking. While after 5 in the afternoon, an employee escaped through a rear door and reached the perimeter. He told officers what they had not known. There was a single shooter inside, and he was holding no one hostage. The order changed. A SWAT sniper named Charles Foster had been positioned on the roof of the post office directly beside the McDonald's, watching through the shattered glass for an angle that would open. At 17 minutes past 5, Huberty moved toward the front of the restaurant near the drive-through window. The angle opened. Foster fired once. Huberty fell and did not move again. 77 minutes. 21 dead. 19 wounded. The youngest victim was 4 months old. The oldest was 74. When the tactical teams entered the building and investigators began their work, the scene they encountered was one that none of them would ever fully leave behind. A doctor who arrived by helicopter later recalled 2 specific images from those first moments inside. Hamburger patties still sizzling on the grills, nobody left to tend to them, and the way the dining area looked, tables still set, trays still out, belongings still in place, as though the people who had been there had simply stood up and stepped away for a moment and would be back. The ordinary and the catastrophic occupying the same space, in silence. The crime scene stretched from the dining area through the kitchen, out through the front and rear exits, across the parking lot and into the street. 40 people had been shot, 21 were dead. Forensic investigators and homicide detectives worked the scene for days. The question everyone needed answered: why was never satisfactorily resolved. Huberty had no manifesto, No list of demands, no stated grievance against McDonald's, against the neighborhood, against any of the people he killed. He had shouted fragments during the rampage about Vietnam, about society, about not deserving to live, but nothing that cohered into a motive investigators could name with confidence. The official classification came back inconclusive. Forensic pathologists suggested Huberty had likely been suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Elevated heavy metals were found in his body, possibly accumulated from years of industrial welding, without adequate protection. His wife filed lawsuits against McDonald's and the Ohio factory where he had worked, arguing food additives and industrial toxins had contributed to his mental deterioration. Both were dismissed. No causal connection could be legally established. The police response was subjected to intense and sustained scrutiny. The central question was one that the families of the dead demanded to have answered. If officers had moved into the building sooner, would more people have survived? If the SWAT unit had been a full-time, professionally maintained tactical team rather than regular patrol officers assembled on call from across the department, would the response have been faster and the timeline of killings shorter? The documentary made about this event decades later takes its title from the number of minutes, 77, because those minutes were not simply the duration of the killing, they were also the duration of the perimeter held outside while the killing continued. The San Diego Police Department conducted a rigorous internal review and reached conclusions that were difficult but unambiguous. The part-time tactical structure that had existed on July 18th was inadequate for a scenario of this kind and could not be allowed to remain. The part-time SWAT structure was dismantled entirely. In its place, the department built a full-time, continuously active tactical unit, professionally trained on a permanent basis, equipped with helicopter support, and organized around a new active shooter intervention protocol that did not default to containment when lives were actively being lost. Mandatory psychological support protocols for all officers who responded to critical incidents were also introduced. The reforms the San Diego Police Department produced in the aftermath of San Ysidro became a reference point for law enforcement agencies across the country in the years that followed. McDonald's suspended all advertising nationally in the aftermath. Burger King did the same, a rare act of solidarity across a competing industry. The corporation pledged $1 million to a survivors fund. Joan Kroc, widow of McDonald's founder Ray Kroc, made a personal contribution of $100,000 to cover burial costs and fund counseling for the families of the dead. The restaurant was demolished in late September of 1984, and the land given to the city with a binding legal condition: no restaurant would ever be built on that site again. The block sat vacant for years. A community activist named Gloria Salas, who had known young Daniel Flores, who had watched the boy ride his bicycle past her door on afternoons just like that Wednesday, led a sustained campaign to turn the location into something that honored the dead rather than simply cleared the ground. She made direct contact with Joan Kroc, who committed the land to the community. Southwestern College eventually acquired it and built a higher education center there. Out front, along San Ysidro Boulevard, the memorial stands 21 white marble hexagonal pillars of varying heights, each one representing one of the people who died. The names on the plaque are almost all Spanish surnames. The building is gone. The college stands in its place, and on the wall of the post office directly beside where the restaurant once was, there are still small holes in the brickwork, bullet holes, unrepaired after more than 40 years. A long-time San Ysidro resident named Raymond Robles, who lost 2 friends in the massacre, returns every year on the anniversary and brings his grandchildren so they can learn what happened on this ground. He pauses at the post office wall every time, standing there for a moment before he says anything. No one has ever patched them up, he always says quietly. 40 years, and they've just been here. What the massacre left behind was not just grief, though grief was everywhere and lasted for decades. It left a generation of survivors carrying something the world in 1984 had no good name for and almost no infrastructure to treat. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet widely understood, and the resources available to the people who walked out of that restaurant alive were minimal to the point of being nearly absent. A clinical study published in the years that followed found that roughly 1/3 of women in the San Ysidro community who had not even been inside the restaurant that afternoon, reported being seriously affected by the massacre. The trauma did not stop at the walls of the building, it moved through the neighborhood. Wendy Flanagan went back to work the very next day at a different McDonald's, because the one she knew was a crime scene. She was not ready. The sound of the French fry alarm sent a physical shock through her body that she could not control. The pattern of the tile floors looked exactly like the floors she had pressed her face against while hiding in the dark. Her manager sent her home. She switched schools, then switched again, trying to leave behind the identity the shooting had forced onto her, the girl from the massacre. She could not hold an enrollment. She did not graduate with her class. She spent years and then decades moving between waitressing jobs and other work she was capable of doing, but could not sustain, carrying something that the people around her could not see and that the mental health systems available to her were not equipped to address. There was no framework for what she was living with, no name that fit it yet, no program built for the particular kind of surviving she was doing. Decades later, she was still in therapy, still working through survivor's guilt. When she speaks publicly now, her first words are always about hope, not resolution, not recovered, but hope. That something she endured might help someone else, somewhere, find their footing. Alberto Leos woke up in a hospital bed surrounded by his family. The neighborhood had rallied around the Leos family in those first weeks. Neighbors brought food, paid what bills they could, showed up at the door. When he healed, he knew with absolute certainty what he wanted to do with the life that had been returned to him. He became a police officer. He served in South Bay communities for years before eventually joining the San Diego Police Department, where he rose to the rank of captain. He calls it his way of giving back to the community that carried him when he could not carry himself. For years after July 18th, the nightmares came vivid, specific, relentless. One night on duty, years into his career, he responded to a call and found a car burning at the side of the road with a man trapped inside it. Every protocol he had been trained on said to hold position and wait for the fire department to arrive. He could not wait. He reached into the flames and pulled the man free. The car exploded behind them as he dragged him clear. After that night, he has said, the nightmares stopped. The massacre entered American history as the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman the country had ever seen, a record it held for 7 years, until the Luby's shooting in Killeen, Texas. It remains the deadliest mass shooting in the history of California. It was also one of the first mass shootings in America ever broadcast live on national television. News cameras had arrived during the siege, while the shooting was still ongoing, and ran continuous, uninterrupted coverage for the full 77 minutes. Millions of people across the country sat in front of their televisions and watched it happen in real time. There was no framework for what they were seeing. There were no protocols for how journalists should cover it, no crisis language for anchors to fall back on, no category in the American vocabulary that fit precisely what was unfolding on the screen. What carries a name now, active shooter, mass casualty event, lone gunman, domestic terrorism, had no agreed-upon name then. People watched. They did not know what to call it or what it meant for what was possible in a country like this. The national debates that followed produced almost no federal legislation. Speeches were made. The moment passed. The guns remained exactly as accessible. The mental health system remained exactly as underfunded. The conversation San Ysidro forced onto the national stage was deferred, and in the years and decades that followed, in Columbine and Sandy Hook and Parkland and Uvalde, the same structural failures reappeared in different cities, different seasons, different buildings, with different names on the lists of the dead. What remained was the question the misspelled name left behind, not just for the investigators or the clinicians, but for everyone who heard the story and asked themselves, what if the phone had rung? What if a callback had come before the next morning? No one can say with certainty that it would have changed anything, but a system designed to catch people before they fall had failed at the most correctable of points, and 21 people were dead, and nobody who was there on that afternoon or who lost someone on that afternoon has ever been able to stop asking why. 21 people came to a McDonald's on a Wednesday afternoon in the summer of 1984. They came for hamburgers and afternoon coffee and something ordinary to do. They came in from across the border. They came down the street on bicycles. They came because it was familiar, it was comfortable, it was the kind of place that nothing ever happens in. They were not a symbol and they were not a statistic. They were a community, and they never came home. Their names are engraved on 21 white marble pillars standing outside a college where thousands of students walk past every single day on their way to classes, and futures that are possible because people before them fought to make something meaningful out of the ground where those 21 people died. Some stop and stand there for a moment and read every name carefully. Many walk past without slowing. But in San Ysidro, in the community itself, the ones who were there and the ones who lost people have never stopped knowing. They have never stopped. And every year, on July 18th, some of them come back to the wall of the post office and look at the bullet holes that no one has ever filled in, and they stand there quietly for a long while.